I'm going to read the quote from CEO of EA, Andrew Wilson, here in just a second. Before I do that, I do want to start by saying that since this news has come out, I think there have been two really strong reactions in opposite directions since the story broke on Kotaku about the future of the Mass Effect franchise and about the future of Bioware. I think there have been two very distinct, very different reactions. One is doom and gloom, that this spells the end for Bioware, the end of Mass Effect, that we should all be hitting the panic button. I don't think that that is correct. But in the other direction, I think there are a large number of hardcore Bioware, hardcore Mass Effect fans, of which I consider myself to be, that are stubbornly refusing to admit that anything has happened. None of this matters. This is just people trying to bring down Mass Effect Andromeda, bring down Bioware. They're trying to naysay, and everything's fine. This means absolutely nothing, and everything's going to proceed as planned. Basically, I think, sticking their heads in the sand. I don't think either one of those reactions is necessarily most correct. So I just want to start up front by saying, if you are sick of the naysaying, the doom and gloom, and people screaming that we should be hitting the panic button, you might be in the right place, because I want to look at this as objectively as possible and try and have a critical analysis of what this news means in the context also of the fourth quarter earnings call that Electronic Arts just had on May 9th, a couple of days ago. If, however, you are on the side of nothing is wrong, let's look at this through a rainbow filter and act like everything is great, you might be in the wrong place, because I don't think that I have a purely optimistic outlook on this. I don't think that this news is great for Bioware, but I do think that we need to take a little bit of time and put it in context so that we can have a balanced, objective analysis of what's going on here. Hello and welcome to the Exalted March, where I talk about Dragon Age, Mass Effect, and Bioware games in general. The quote from Andrew Wilson, CEO of Electronic Arts, on the earnings call that took place a couple of days ago. Actually, you know what? Before we get to the quote from Andrew Wilson, for those of you who are not familiar with the story, which if you clicked on this, you probably are, Jason Schreier of Kotaku posted a story citing 4 unnamed sources in or around Bioware, stating that the Montreal Bioware studio was going to be, he originally used the term downsize, and he's now changed that to scaled back to eliminate the indication that anyone was being laid off, which he has said is not happening as far as he knows. And that some of the personnel from Bioware Montreal are being moved to Motive Studios, which they share studio spaces with, all underneath the umbrella of EA. Since that's come out, some people have taken that as an indication that the Mass Effect franchise, and also in that story, he expresses that Mass Effect is sort of being put on pause. At least that's the indication that he gives, that there is not work being done at Bioware Montreal directly right now on Mass Effect. And some people have taken that to mean that we should have great trepidation about the future of the franchise. So I want to read a quote from Yannick Roy, the studio manager at Bioware Montreal. Kotaku did reach out to EA for a statement, and they sent back this statement from Yannick. Quote, "Our teams at Bioware and across EA put in tremendous effort bringing Mass Effect Andromeda to players around the world. Even as Bioware continues to focus on the Mass Effect Andromeda community and live service, we are constantly looking at how we're prepared for the next experiences we will create. The teams in EA Worldwide Studios are packed with talent, and more than ever, we are driving collaboration between studios on key projects. With our Bioware and Motive teams sharing studio space in Montreal, we have Bioware team members joining Motive projects that are underway. We're also ramping up teams on other Bioware projects in development. There will be much more to come from Bioware in the years ahead." End quote. So my initial reaction when I read this is, that is not the quote that you want. If you're a fan of, well, you know what, not even from the fan perspective, if you're Electronic Arts and you're a publicly held company, you don't respond with that quote to when Kotaku reaches out to you for a statement. You know, for those of you who don't know exactly how this works, when Jason Schreier says we reached out to EA for comment, what that typically means in some cases is that EA is sent an early draft of what the actual story is, or at the very least an indication of what the content of the story is going to be, and maybe even an indication of, you know, what the feeling of the headline is going to be. So Electronic Arts was made fully aware that there was going to be a story giving some indication that the future development of the Mass Effect franchise is in question, and that the Montreal Bioware studio is somehow being dispersed or maybe disbanded or somehow scaled back. In light of knowing that that is the story that's going to run on one of the largest gaming sites on the internet, relatively close to the launch that you just had for Mass Effect Andromeda and going into the next fiscal quarter, that's not the statement you release. Okay, what I just read from Yannick Roy, that's not the statement you release. I understand they're a big company and they're going to use PR speak and they're going to use measured language and they're never going to be exactly direct. But you have to come out and say, we're committed to Bioware Montreal. They did a great job developing Mass Effect Andromeda and they're working on more content for Mass Effect Andromeda as we speak. And you're going to see that coming out in the immediate future. The line, there's more to come from Bioware in the years ahead. Well, yeah, I mean, that's no shit. That's the baseline of what we should be expecting. What that line should read is that you're going to see more Mass Effect Andromeda content coming from Bioware Montreal within months ahead. Not years, months. We don't have anything to announce. We can't tell you the release date of the first major piece of DLC. Without announcing anything officially, Bioware Montreal is absolutely working on Mass Effect Andromeda DLC because they did a great job with the game, and we're looking forward to them taking the reins on the Mass Effect franchise going forward. You can say everything you need to say within measured language, within PR speak that a big company like EA is known for using, while absolutely crushing a rumor like this. You're a publicly held company who has to manage the expectations of shareholders, and you have to make sure that if dumb rumors come out that stir the waters and make people think that you're disbanding one of your studios or significantly scaling it down to the point where you're dispersing personnel from that studio elsewhere, you have to crush that rumor. And you have to do it in a way that's fitting a big corporation. You've got to do it in PR speak. But this statement is a very weak, tepid statement from EA. And it doesn't deny anything in Jason Schreier's story at all. Not only does it not deny it, it doesn't assert anything to the contrary. I mean, everything in Jason Schreier's story can be true, and everything in Yannick Roy's statement can be true. They basically sidestep the issue, so it's not a great response. That being said, we've got the quote here from Andrew Wilson, who's the CEO of EA. This was on the fourth quarter earnings call that took place a couple of days ago, and he was asked about Mass Effect Andromeda. And he was asked about Mass Effect Andromeda and also the future of Bioware. They announced on the earnings call that the new intellectual property that Bioware Edmonton has been working on for some time now, they announced that would be delayed until fiscal year 19. So that could be as early as the end of calendar year 2018. So it could be holiday 2018 and as late as September 2019. When he was asked about Mass Effect Andromeda, this is Andrew Wilson, quote, "Mass Effect Andromeda delivers a rich, deep experience which celebrates what makes the franchise great. Wonderful, beautiful, deep, rich worlds, amazing combat, and engaging, fast-paced multiplayer. New multiplayer content is continued to be released, and new content kind of arriving overall more regularly," end quote. So the quote gets kind of weak there at the end. He says new content kind of arriving overall more regularly. This is transcribed from the call that they had a couple of days ago. It's slightly more vague, but it's still a little bit closer in that he's assuring you more Mass Effect Andromeda content is coming out. So this is a slightly better quote from Andrew Wilson. He kind of takes a little more ownership of it and says, no, we've definitely got more Andromeda content coming out. He kind of points that more towards the multiplayer side than anything like an expansion pack or DLC for single player. But it's slightly better. He goes on a little bit further. There's a little more to the quote as far as BioWare in general. So he says, quote, "We're very happy with kind of how BioWare is doing, how BioWare is treating Mass Effect. And our expectations for Mass Effect are still strong for the future and the franchise overall. In terms of the new IP, the choice to move the new IP and what happened with Mass Effect are completely unrelated," end quote. He then goes on to talk about the new IP and the technological challenges around it. I'm not going to quote it entirely because it's basically just a long-winded boilerplate piece of PR rhetoric where he says, we're industry leaders, and being an industry leader is all about innovation, and we want to do this connected live service, continual delivery of content type thing. That takes a lot of time to do, and we want to give the team all the time in the world, blah, blah, blah. So we already know, based on rumors about the new intellectual property from BioWare, that it's going to be something Destiny-esque. very similar to Bungie's Destiny, where it's kind of like a persistent online something rather, not quite an MMO. So he kind of goes on to talk about that in relation to the future of Bioware and give some reassurance about the Mass Effect franchise in general. Now, I bring up these quotes from Yannick Roy and from Andrew Wilson, and I'm going to give you another quote from Blake Jorgensen, the CFO and Executive Vice President of EA, here in just a second. But I bring up these quotes in relation to the Kotaku story because I think the reaction to that story, again, goes into two very different directions, and I don't think either one of them does a good job of appreciating and really breaking down the strategy of EA in relation to Bioware and in relation to the Mass Effect series. And I think if you have interest in trying to figure out where Mass Effect is going and where Bioware is going, you have to do it in the context of what EA is trying to do as a business. So often I do have to remind my friends and myself, because I'm a gamer who thinks of games as wonderful pieces of art and deep, meaningful experiences that really resonate with people. And I have to constantly remind myself that to EA, this is a product line and this is a business, and they think of it within the umbrella of their overall strategy for their company and how to generate as much profit as possible for their shareholders. So EA has a strategy, and everything that they do with Mass Effect and with Bioware is going to be within that strategy, or they're going to try and fit it within that strategy. So what is EA's strategy for their company, for this lineup of games? Well, they make it pretty clear that their strategy is delivering live services. They don't even call them games anymore in most cases. They really refer to their products as live services. And you see that in the Yannick Roy quote, and you heard it continually throughout the EA earnings call. Live services, as they describe it, is games that deliver continual content and an evolving experience that keeps players coming back, and it really keeps players engaged with that product. So live services are seen really well in games like Battlefield, Madden, FIFA, Star Wars Battlefront, and within Bioware, probably the only product that really matches that description really well is Star Wars The Old Republic, because that actually is an MMO, and so there's obviously continual content there with their expansion packs and other add-ons that can be purchased for the game. The traditional Bioware game, which is a single-player RPG, that's a little bit harder to see how that type of game fits into their strategy, but that's what they're going to be going for. Now multiplayer is a part of both Dragon Age and Mass Effect, and smaller add-on content is now becoming a regular staple of Bioware games, where in the past it was not. So I'm going to give you another quote here from Blake Jorgensen. Again, this is the Chief Financial Officer and Executive Vice President for EA. This was also on the earnings call. He says, quote, so for context, they were asked about some acquisitions, whether or not they were going to be acquiring any other studios in the future, and he kind of talks about what they're looking for. As far as making acquisitions, he did say that they were kind of keeping eyes and ears open, and that some of the valuations that they saw were not necessarily what they were looking for, so they're not doing any acquisitions now, but he describes what they're looking for, or one of the things that they're looking for in regards to live services. So he says, quote, "We're continuing to keep our eyes and ears open, particularly for things that can add to either games that don't have live services and we can layer live services into them, or games that could leverage our network and our scale that we don't have." So that's very interesting, right? He says games that don't have live services that we can layer live services into. And that's essentially what they did with Bioware. They took single-player RPG games that really had no live services, or they didn't really have major DLC or multiplayer components, and they put those components into them. To give you a little more context to that sort of mindset and the mindset that exists at EA right now, they talked about how happy they were with the inclusion of a campaign of a story mode into FIFA. And they talked about the critical reception that it got and how well they think that it is as a game mode on its own, but they specifically called out that they like the story mode in FIFA because it brings in a different type of player who maybe isn't playing FIFA Ultimate Team and isn't playing FIFA multiplayer online. They really quite blatantly said that they're glad that FIFA has a story mode so it can bring people into FIFA and then play the other modes that are actually kind of more like live services. So I think, although they weren't talking about Mass Effect or Dragon Age specifically, I think it's pretty clear that at EA, they see single-player, story-driven content as a way to get people into an ecosystem and into an environment, basically to get you playing the game so that eventually you are drawn to the microtransactions, DLC, and multiplayer content. So that's a good indication of what strategy is at EA. And again, I think everything that they're doing, if they're being consistent, should fit in to that strategy. And also worth noting that Blake Jorgensen's quote there was in the context of a question asked about growth and about acquisitions. So they're certainly not moving away from this in any way, shape, or form. They're basically saying if we are going to expand, if we are going to make acquisitions, it's going to be so that we can, amongst other things, do this. Take games that don't have live services and put live services into them. Okay, so there's going to be more of this in the future, not less, for those of you who are maybe disappointed with some of the MMO-style content in Dragon Age Inquisition and Mass Effect Andromeda. Maybe that's not what you want to hear. Personally, it's not my favorite thing, although I do enjoy MMOs. I enjoy Star Wars: The Old Republic. I would like to see something closer to Dragon Age Origins and maybe some of the older style Bioware formula games. So what does this mean for Mass Effect? What does it mean for Mass Effect Andromeda? I think, in short, what it means is we better see DLC announced for Mass Effect Andromeda, and we better see it fast. Because if the strategy for EA is to make sure that there are live services in their games, which means a continual delivery of new content, there's going to have to be some major new content going forward. There are little tiny pieces and little adjustments being made. There are patches being released. They just released a second patch for Andromeda shortly, and they're adding small things like more casual outfits, tweaks to multiplayer, small additions to some of the character lineups in the multiplayer for Mass Effect Andromeda. But if this is their strategy overall, it would make sense that they are at least working on one piece of major DLC for Mass Effect Andromeda. And if they're not, no, I don't think we should hit the panic button, but somebody's going to have to explain to me that if if the strategy for EA, a major corporation that seems to be pushing all of their resources and all of their effort and all of their focus to delivering on this strategy of live services, and you have a major release that Andrew Wilson talked about in another part of the call, how long the development cycle was, and a lot of time and effort went into this release, so it's a big release for them, and you're not moving Mass Effect Andromeda in line with that strategy, well, then what is the strategy for Mass Effect Andromeda? If they're not working on DLC for Mass Effect Andromeda, then Mass Effect Andromeda doesn't fit into the EA strategy whatsoever. Now, whether I like that or don't like that, as a longtime fan of Bioware and a longtime fan of Mass Effect, I would prefer more complete overall experiences at launch, and I wouldn't really mind if there was less DLC. But that's not what we're dealing with right now. We're dealing with EA clearly stating unequivocally, this is our strategy: live services, continual flow of content, a constantly evolving experiences that keeps players engaged, and that means DLC. That means lots of new content. For BioWare Montreal and the news on BioWare Montreal, and the fact that it seems like, at least according to the sources that are included in the Kotaku story, I think it makes sense. Honestly, I know that's probably not what a lot of BioWare fans would want to hear, but if you look at how BioWare Montreal got started, they were started to work on DLC for Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3. They were essentially a studio started to do extra work, and they got this opportunity to take on a full game. And no matter how much I liked Mass Effect Andromeda, and I would say I actually more than liked it, I loved Mass Effect Andromeda. When I was done playing Mass Effect Andromeda, I was sure that it was one of the best experiences that I've had playing a game in a long time. Whether or not that's a widespread opinion, whether or not people agree with me, I know that there are technical flaws in the game. I know that people who didn't feel that way aren't wrong. If you weren't a big fan of Mass Effect Andromeda, you're not wrong. I just subjectively really, really, really love the game. I had a blast with it, and I'm going through a second playthrough right now. I loved it. Be that as it may, no matter how much I have liked it, no matter how much hardcore BioWare fans have liked it, the fact is the reception for the game is not as good as EA would have liked, and that's exactly what Andrew Wilson said on the earnings call, is that the reception critically was not what they would have hoped, is not what they hoped for. And so you have that being the result from Bioware Montreal. And if you're EA and you're looking at this from a strategy standpoint, from a business standpoint, focusing in on Bioware Edmonton, focusing in on Bioware Austin, and for their particular strengths, that's a sound move. I mean, Edmonton has always delivered the best content for Bioware overall. They really delivered almost all of the content. I mean, let's be honest. Again, Montreal was really an expansion studio to do extra work. So Edmonton is really the heart of Bioware, and then Austin has also had some success with the Old Republic. So from a business standpoint, it makes most sense. And also, again, let's point out for the live services strategy, Austin handling Star Wars The Old Republic, they fit in very clearly, and Edmonton being the core of Bioware, where most of the great success that Bioware has had with single-player experiences, that's been done in Edmonton, so that makes sense. But if this is the result that you've gotten the first time Bioware Montreal has been given the full reins on a title, you know, maybe it does make sense to kind of disperse them to other places and then keep yourself centered, to not spread yourself too thin, and to keep yourself focused on the core of Bioware that has always worked most effectively. So if you're seeing this news as a reason to sound the alarm, as a reason to call out that this is the end of Bioware, the end of Mass Effect, I think you're wrong. I think this is you're probably seeing disaster where there is none. But I also think that if you are ignoring this news wholesale and saying this is just rumor and speculation, this means nothing, then you're also probably being a little overly optimistic. You kind of have to listen to what Andrew Wilson said about Mass Effect Andromeda. There's definitely confidence in the Mass Effect franchise. There's definitely confidence in BioWare overall. But he does openly admit that the result for Mass Effect was not exactly what they were hoping for. And so it would make sense from a business standpoint to then maybe scale back on Montreal and focus your efforts in on where you know you've had more success in the past, in Edmonton and in Austin. So I don't know. I keep seeing the reactions to this on social media and on different places where Mass Effect and BioWare fans congregate, and I don't see a lot of middle ground. I see a lot of people maybe overreacting, and then a lot of people getting mad at the people overreacting and insisting that this means nothing and everything's fine and Mass Effect is going to do great and this is all just completely normal and this doesn't signify anything at all for BioWare. And I don't think that either one of those conclusions is exactly right. I think that the more balanced and critical way to look at this is that when you see a studio that just finished delivering and shipping a major title and their publisher is not definitively saying that they are working on more content for the game and that these sort of rumors are completely false, that is a little concerning. It doesn't mean Mass Effect's in trouble or necessarily that BioWare's in trouble, but there's definitely a shift in strategy that was not expected. Because again, if you're EA and a major gaming news source says, we're running this story, do you have a comment on it? You have an obligation to crush that rumor if it is completely false. If you know that the indication of that story is going to be one of your major franchises is getting put on hiatus and getting put on pause and there's no new content being worked on for it, and the studio that you just expanded to being a full-scale studio is now their personnel is now being dispersed into another studio. If those things aren't true, you have to say those things aren't true. And you have to say, no, actually, that's not correct. BioWare Montreal is still working on Mass Effect Andromeda. They've got new content coming out shortly, and we're fully committed to delivering live services within Mass Effect Andromeda. You have to say that. And if you don't say that in response to this story, then that means you are scaling back BioWare Montreal, and they are being dispersed, and maybe there's not the content that there originally was planned for Mass Effect Andromeda. Because again, looking at this in context with EA's overall strategy of delivering continual content as a live service for their games, something doesn't add up. If you're not telling us that more content is on the way for Mass Effect Andromeda shortly, then something about Mass Effect Andromeda and BioWare Montreal no longer fits into the overall strategy for EA. And that doesn't signify the death of Mass Effect by any stretch of the imagination. It probably just means that we're going to have to wait a little bit longer for new content, and maybe some of the ideas about how Mass Effect Andromeda delivers on that live services strategy for EA, maybe something about that has to go back to the drawing board and has to be reworked. We'll see what comes from Mass Effect in the coming weeks and months. I hope that it's more DLC and more content, but for now, it looks like we're going to have to wait and see. Thanks as always for listening, and we'll see you next time.